Hello, I'm Joyce Tischler. Welcome to Military Working Dogs, War Heroes Treated as Property. I want to remind people this is an unusual panel for us. And I just want to remind people this is an educational conference, and we often invite speakers as our guests who express viewpoints that may differ with some people in our audience. We have had representatives of the meat industry. We've had animal researchers. And today we've got people who both have had very long, distinguished military careers in which dogs have been their partners. So I ask that when we get to the question period, we be respectful and civil if people disagree. Our first speaker is Mark Eichelman, Deputy District Counsel for the Portland District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Mark spent close to 3 decades in the U.S. Army in a variety of capacities, and as an attorney in the Army Judge Advocate General's Office, the JAG Corps, and he fought in Desert Storm, where he was decorated for valor in combat. His top military awards are the Legion of Merit and the Bronze Star. He recently retired from the Army with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, which was way up there, isn't it? He earned his BS from West Point, his JD from the University of Tulsa, and he earned 2 LLMs because, as we all know, one is never enough. Kanahara. His first LLM was in military law from the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center, and the other was environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark Law School, which is where he met professors Kathy Hessler and Pam Frosch, and where we found out about him. In 2004, Mark and his wife Paige adopted a 2 or 3-year-old border collie mix who they named Toby. Toby had no eyes. He was born with no eyes. And in 2005, they entered Toby in the Tails in Need's Great American Mutt contest. Tails in Need is a New York City-based nonprofit that promotes public awareness about the value of adopting mixed breed, unwanted, and abandoned dogs. And out of the hundreds of entrants, Toby was chosen as a finalist by a celebrity panel. And then in a nationwide online vote, Toby got more votes than all of the other finalists combined. So Toby was the Great American Mutt in 2005. And this inspired the Charlottesville, I can't pronounce this, Albemarle SPCA, the shelter where Paige worked and where they adopted Tony from. They created a $300,000 endowment called the Toby Fund to take special care of special needs shelter animals. Finally, Mark and his wife Paige live with 4 rescues, 2 dogs, 2 cats, and he very smartly brought her here today because it is today their 22nd wedding anniversary. Smart man. Now, Mark is going to address the history of the use of dogs in the military, the ROBBY law, which he will tell you about, and the current military working dog program. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Joyce, and thank you to ALDF for having me. I consider it an honor and a privilege to be here today. And I'd also like to thank all of you for being here, and I'll tell you why. When I was a young JAG officer, I was asked to give a briefing on the law of war to a battalion's worth of soldiers. And so on the day of the briefing, I went to an auditorium similar to this. I was there 10 to 15 minutes early, because in the military, if you're on time, you're late. So I got there early, got all set up. I was the only one there. I waited 10 minutes, I waited 15 minutes, I waited 20 minutes. I'm still all alone in this auditorium. So I called the battalion headquarters, and they told me, oh, we canceled that briefing. But obviously nobody bothered to call and tell me. So whenever I have to give a talk or a class or a presentation, and I actually have people to talk to, I figure at least I'm starting off on the right foot. I have a couple of caveats or disclaimers before I begin. Yes, I am a retired Army officer, and I do work for the Army now as a civilian attorney, but I'm here in my personal, individual capacity. Any opinions expressed are my own. Now, having said that, I have spent over half of my life in uniform, so if I do slip up along the way and say we when I talk about what the military may have done, please cut me some slack and refer back to caveat number 1. All right. So now let's talk about military working dogs. And this is the agenda I'm going to follow for my portion of the presentation here today. So let's start at the beginning with the history. And dogs have been used for military purposes for thousands of years. But since we are interested in the U.S. military's use of dogs, we're going to jump to the 1800s. The first official use of dogs for military purposes in the United States was during the Seminole Wars of the early to mid-19th century, where bloodhounds were used for tracking purposes in Florida. Couldn't find any photos from the Seminole Wars for obvious reasons, so this is as close as I could come. For the historically inclined, you may recognize that as George Custer during the Civil War with one of his dogs. Now we're going to jump forward to World War I. In the early 20th century, during World War I, European armies used dogs to great advantage, but the U.S. Army had no military working dog program at that time, though some dogs did serve unofficially with U.S. units as mascots, sentries, and messengers, just as they had in our prior conflicts. When the U.S. entered World War II, the American Kennel Club and another group, Dogs for Defense, appealed to dog owners across the country to donate their pets to the war effort, thus beginning America's first formal dog procurement program. In all, the U.S. Army acquired about 19,000 dogs, about half of which were trained, mostly as sentries. The dogs spanned 30 different breeds, but following the British example from World War I, the Canine Corps was built around 5 breeds: Belgian Shepherds, Giant Schnauzers, Collies, German Shepherds, and Doberman Pinschers. Because so many dogs loaned to the military during World War II proved unfit for military duty, and the expense of returning them to their owners fell to the military, after the war, the Army changed its procurement policy and began buying its own dogs. No longer borrowing family pets from the citizenry and instead buying dogs in bulk was the genesis, starting in 1949, of military working dogs being considered equipment by the Department of Defense. As a result, military working dogs were assigned national stock numbers, just like every other piece of military equipment, and dogs were now accounted for on units' property books. Once the military started purchasing dogs, the dog of choice was the German Shepherd as the Korean War began. Now, only one dog unit served during the Korean War, and when the war ended, the procurement of dogs stopped, and the Army War Dog Program was defunded. Rumors that the program would be abandoned completely drew an angry public response, resulting in the program's survival, but now under the direction of the U.S. Air Force, who started the Dog Training Center at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, run by the 341st Training Squadron. Thus, the Air Force became the single service manager for the Department of Defense Military Working Dog Program. With the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam, the demand for military working dogs outstripped supply. So small teams of recruiters were sent to military bases around the country to buy up dogs from neighboring communities. The price paid was usually no more than $150 per dog, and 3,800 dogs would ultimately serve during the course of the war. They are credited with saving thousands of lives while protecting troops, leading jungle patrols, and detecting ambushes and mines. But the military considered most of these dogs too dangerous to return back to the United States, as many sentry dogs had been trained to be so vicious that even their handlers had a difficult time controlling them. Ultimately, only about 200 military working dogs returned from Vietnam, as it was feared that even less violent dogs could carry diseases back from Southeast Asia. Now, one would think that that issue at least could have been solved with a quarantine problem, but regardless, most dogs were left behind in Vietnam or put down. By left behind, I do not mean to imply that the dogs were set loose on the streets of Saigon. Instead, many were turned over to the South Vietnamese military, our allies. What ultimately became of these dogs with our withdrawal from Vietnam and the subsequent fall of South Vietnam is unclear, but it most likely was not good. This brings us to our most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The most common job of today's military working dogs, or war dogs as they are known, is sniffing out explosives, as the improvised explosive device, or IED, is our enemy's weapon of choice. A trained dog can detect and alert on dozens of different explosive scents. Despite the fact that the DoD has spent literally billions of dollars on ways to counter and defeat IEDs, nothing has proven anywhere near as effective as explosive sniffing dogs. Prompting General David Petraeus, former commander in both Iraq and Afghanistan, to state, the capability they bring to the fight cannot be replicated by man or machine. It is hard to quantify how many lives deployed military working dogs save by way of their detection skills. Figures range from 150 to 1,800 lives per dog, but it is impossible to count exactly how many people did not get hurt by a bomb that was discovered by a military working dog. In just 1 year, 2010, military working dogs in Afghanistan alone were credited with finding more than 12,500 pounds of explosives, hence my choice of photo here. The DoD has some 2,700 military working dogs in service worldwide and has had as many as 600 serving in war zones at any one time. Another 200 contract working dogs were also employed because the DoD's military working dog program could not supply enough dogs to meet the demand. Now, this is my own photo from Afghanistan in Kabul, and interestingly, these dogs and their handlers all came from Zimbabwe. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the dogs themselves. The dogs the DoD uses now are not usually pedigreed or registered, as the DoD wants functionality and not pure breed lines. Military working dogs are divided into two broad groups, single-purpose dogs and dual-purpose dogs, with dual-purpose dogs making up the vast majority. Single-purpose dogs are used for detection, sniffing out explosive or narcotics, never both, and combat tracking dogs are trained to sniff out humans. Single-purpose dogs tend to be sporting breeds, and their training at Lackland Air Force Base takes 90 days. There are many different kinds of single-purpose dogs, to include explosive detector dogs, narcotics detector dogs, specialized search dogs, combat tracker dogs, mine detection dogs, tactical explosive detector dogs, and IED detector dogs. Detection training takes about 60 days, and in order to certify as a detection dog, drug dogs need to achieve a 90% accuracy, and explosive dogs need to achieve a 95% accuracy. Now, dual-purpose dogs do both patrol work, which means that they have been trained to attack, as well as detection work, and some basic scouting or tracking of human scent. Dual-purpose dogs tend to be German Shepherds, Belgian Malinois, or Dutch Shepherds. Almost all of these dogs are acquired by the Department of Defense in Europe, when they are 2 or 3 years old, and Uncle Sam pays somewhere between $3,000 and $4,500 per dog. Dual-purpose dogs include patrol explosive detector dogs and patrol narcotic detector dogs. The training of dual-purpose dogs at Lackland takes 120 days, longer than it does for the single-purpose dogs, obviously, and during this time, dogs are taught fundamental obedience, detection, and patrol work. A few years ago, the DoD began producing its own Belgian Malinois at Lackland Air Force Base, such as the puppy you see here. They seek to whelp 200 puppies per year and thus reduce the number of dogs that are purchased overseas. The DoD has experimented with obtaining dogs from shelters, which is what the British military does, but rarely is a dog found that can pass our military's rigorous screening standards. In addition to military working dogs, the Army also uses specially trained stress therapy dogs, notably Labrador retrievers, such as you see here, to help deployed soldiers relax and cope better with the stresses that they endure. Now, military working dogs themselves are not immune to the stresses of combat. Until 2011, PTSD was not officially recognized in dogs. But by that time, studies show that about 5% of the military working dogs returning from deployment were coming back with signs that could be diagnosed as PTSD, which is now known as canine PTSD or CPTSD. Affected dogs receive a combination of different therapies and drugs, which can include anti-anxiety medications and antidepressants. 1/4 of military working dogs treated for PTSD return to their jobs. 1/4 are assigned to less stressful duties. 1/4 will need long-term therapy, and 1/4 cannot work again and are retired from service and hopefully then adopted. Which brings us to the issue of adoption of military working dogs. Now, going back to World War II, at the end of that conflict, most attack-trained dogs, such as we see here in the attack training mode, were retrained and rehomed. For example, of the 550 Marine war dogs that had been trained to attack, only 4 were put down because they could not be detrained well enough for civilian life. The other 545 were adopted out. And prior to the conflict in Vietnam, nearly all dogs used by the U.S. military were trained as sentry or attack dogs. Bite-trained dogs who were no longer able to work were considered by the military to be unadoptable, as being too much of a liability risk. Some were transferred to law enforcement agencies, but most were unfortunately put down. However, most of that small percentage of non-attack trained dogs were adopted out. Treating attack-trained military working dogs as unadoptable and putting them down at the end of their usefulness was U.S. policy for 50 years, until the passage in 2000 of the so-called ROBBY law. The ROBBY law, which started out as H.R. 5314, was introduced in 2000 by Representative Roscoe G. Bartlett of Maryland. After Representative Bartlett read an article in Stars and Stripes, which is a military newspaper, that pointed out how most military working dogs could not be adopted when they were retired. The article had referenced an attack-trained Belgian Malinois named ROBBY, hence the name of the law. ROBBY had numerous serious health issues and was euthanized despite the fact that his handler wanted to adopt him. The ROBBY law was passed unanimously by Congress, as hard as that may be to believe in today's military climate, and was signed into law by President Clinton just 2 months after it was introduced. It is codified at 10 U.S.C. section 2583, and it is probably worth noting that the chapter this section falls under is titled Exchange of Materials and Disposal of Obsolete, Surplus, or Unclaimed Property. The statute provides that DoD military working dogs who can no longer work or are no longer needed by the DoD be made available for adoption, that the commander of a military working dog's last unit determines suitability for adoption after consulting with the unit's veterinarian, that military working dogs may be adopted by law enforcement agencies, former handlers, and other persons capable of humanely caring for the dogs, that adoptions be without charge, that the United States shall not be liable for any acts or omissions of adopted military working dogs, nor for any veterinary expenses incurred by military working dogs. And lastly, that the Secretary of Defense shall provide an annual report to Congress specifying the number of military working dogs adopted the preceding year, the number of awaiting adoption, and the number euthanized, along with an explanation of why the dog was euthanized rather than retained for adoption. Now, in keeping with that last provision, for example, in 2010, the DoD adopted out 304 military working dogs and transferred 34 more to law enforcement. 8 dogs healthy enough for adoption were put down as being too dangerous for adoption, while 12 dogs temperamentally suited for adoption were put down due to serious health issues and intractable pain. Now, while ROBBY's law was a great step forward for the adoption of retired military working dogs, it did not solve all adoption-related problems, nor did it address some issues that only became more prevalent with the growth of the military working dog program due to our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Because remember, ROBBY's law was passed in 2000 before the War on Terror began. Now, for instance, until last year, military working dogs that retired at our permanent bases overseas, such as in Germany, Japan, and Korea, they remained at that base until they were adopted. They were not returned to the United States. Just as a piece of military hardware that is pulled out of service overseas is not brought back to the United States. Private individuals and organizations, however, could pay to have the dogs flown back to the States for adoption, but that can cost anywhere from $400 to $2,000 depending on location, time of year, and the size of the dog. And I want to make it clear, we're not talking about military working dogs here that are deployed to places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Upon completion of their tours, these dogs are returned to their permanent bases from which they deployed. But some dogs did languish at our permanent overseas bases, even while there was plenty of demand for adoptable military working dogs back in the United States. More legislation was clearly needed. So, subsequent legislation. In 2012, the Canine Members of the Armed Forces Act was introduced in Congress. The bill attempted to alleviate the issues of retired military working dogs left at our permanent bases overseas, as well as other perceived shortcomings related to military working dogs. It sought to reclassify military working dogs as canine members of the armed forces, hence they would no longer be considered equipment. It sought to facilitate the adoption of military working dogs by allowing dogs located at facilities without suitable adoption options to be transported to Lackland Air Force Base or another appropriate location utilizing donated frequent flyer miles. It sought to establish and maintain a system via a contract with a private nonprofit entity to provide for the veterinary care of retired military working dogs, many of whom will have health issues. And lastly, it sought to create a decoration or other appropriate recognition for military working dogs that are killed in action or perform an exceptionally meritorious or courageous act in service to the United States. Unfortunately, this bill was not enacted, but continued public pressure to return retired military working dogs to the United States at government expense to facilitate their adoption did result in a recent amendment to ROBBY's law. The 2016 Defense Department budget bill, signed by President Obama, contained provisions directing the military to bring all retired military working dogs back to the states at government expense. So, what do adoptions look like now? Because of their unique temperament and training, the military does not surrender its retiring military working dogs to shelters, rescues, or sanctuaries for placement. All military working dog adoptions are handled through the Defense Military Working Dog Adoption Program. If a dog is still serviceable upon its official retirement from the military, adoption priority is given to civilian law enforcement. For dogs who are no longer able to serve, the handlers get priority, and then the general public. Through a careful process of evaluation and selection, an estimated 300 retired military working dogs are placed or adopted each year. The vast majority, or over 90%, of retiring dogs are adopted by their handlers. There is a waiting list of about 60 law enforcement agencies hoping for a good working dog, and the average wait time for a member of the public hoping to adopt a military working dog from Lackland Air Force Base is about 18 months. So there is a lot of demand out there. Dogs put up for adoption go through behavioral testing, and any dog who has ever trained in patrol work will go through a bite muzzle test to determine how much fight is left in the dog. Interestingly, dog-on-dog aggression is something of a problem because of the stock the dogs come from, the fact that most male dogs are unneutered, and lastly, because military working dogs do not get to interact much with each other. Efforts are afoot to alleviate this dog aggression problem by getting military working dogs more acclimated to each other by letting them have playtime together, off-leash, in fenced-in areas. The average age of a retiring military working dog is 8.3 years. And now, before I turn things back over to Joyce and Ryan, I have a few closing thoughts. Now, as we know, the military as an institution classifies military working dogs like equipment or property. But lest we forget, this is really no different than how animals and pets in the civilian world are legally classified as property or chattel. And just as many of us don't think of animals or our pets this way, I would argue that in the military working dogs are neither perceived nor treated like equipment by their handlers, by the soldiers they protect, by the units they serve with, or by the veterinarians that care for them. Officially, military working dogs do not hold rank, but it is a common practice, especially among Army handlers, to unofficially give the dog one rank higher than the handler, thus showing respect for the dog and its unique skills and abilities. Soldiers know that a military working dog and its handlers are out front, walking point, seeking out explosives and ambushes to keep them alive. And while the military does not officially recognize military working dogs with awards, units routinely recognize the heroism and sacrifice of their military working dogs with unofficial awards of the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, etc. Military working dogs wounded in combat are medevaced by helicopter, just like wounded soldiers. They receive top-notch trauma care, just like soldiers. They receive artificial limbs and rehabilitation, just like soldiers. And military working dogs receive memorial services, just like soldiers. The last statistic I found showed that between 2005 and 2012, 44 military working dogs died in war zones, killed in action, or died of heat injuries or other causes. And during that same period of time, 17 handlers were also lost. Ultimately, while the equipment designation had much to do with military working dogs being stranded at our bases overseas awaiting adoption, I don't think it was why, before the enactment of ROBBY's law, that military working dogs were put down at the end of their useful period of service. Rightly or wrongly, I think it was the liability concerns over adopting out attack-trained dogs, since non-attack-trained dogs were adopted out during this period. And they were no less equipment in the eyes of the military than attack-trained dogs. Thankfully, and hopefully forever, these adoption issues are behind us. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Ryan Henderson, who is also a veteran of the U.S. Army. He has served as an airborne infantryman, commander, personal security operative, assault team leader, battalion combatives instructor, and a tactical explosive detection dog, or TED, handler, as well as a battalion K-9 detachment team leader. He was stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We asked Ryan to speak to you about a controversy that has pitted soldiers against their own military. Ryan's involvement started when, in his role as a TED handler, he was assigned to an all-black German Shepherd who unfortunately had been named Satan. They trained together and then worked together in treacherous conditions. The depth of their relationship and the bond that developed between Ryan and Satan is the kind that he didn't name the dog. At any rate, it's the kind of relationship that some of us are lucky enough to experience only once or twice in our lives with a dog. Equally unfortunately, Ryan suffered a grand mal seizure caused by the military work he was doing. He was medevaced from Afghanistan to Germany in July 2012, and when he woke up in a German hospital, he had been separated from Satan. He wants to adopt Satan. He has always, and he's been trying to do so since his retirement from the Army in 2013. But something strange happened in the adoption process for a large number of those military dogs who were returned to the U.S. We have read media reports, and from those reports, we can see that a company called K2 Solutions, which according to these reports trains dogs for combat and counterterrorism, K2 held a mass and rather rushed adoption event in 2014, and approximately 200 of the military dogs, including Satan, were adopted to civilians, despite the fact that numerous soldiers, including Ryan, had applied to adopt these dogs they had handled. Ryan did everything he could to adopt Satan, but his application appears to have been ignored along with many others. The Army and K2 have refused to disclose the details or the reasons for the manner in which the adoptions were handled. And prior to this conference, we were trying to get additional information, but were not successful. So the facts are still murky. Since leaving the Army, Ryan has returned to civilian life in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, where he lives with his wife Stephanie, their two daughters, and a house full of rescue animals, including 2 dogs, 1 cat, a rabbit, and a guinea pig. And Stephanie's here with us today as well. She agreed to come and be with us, so thank you. So Ryan, we'd like to hear about your experience.
How's everybody doing? Good, good. I want to add that the rabbit's the toughest animal in the whole house. So, yeah. I just want to start off by saying hello and thank you very much for having me here. That is Satan. That's a picture of he and I in a village called Spengunde. It's funny how I can remember that since my memory is one of the things most worstly affected by the TBI from the grand mal seizure, but I know where that is. I want to start off a little bit. We already touched very briefly on the history of dog and man, and mainly from the American Army side. But it's important to know that dog and man have worked together since they came in contact in the wild. If you look, Cro-Magnon man worked with dogs. Alexander the Great, you can see pictures there. Ancient Egypt, them working with dogs. The Romans have a long charted history of working with dogs. European military. I think dogs truly were put here to guard man. That's my thought on it. I think that's their reason for existence, and they're very good at it. And they're man's best friend, and we say that for a reason. Sorry. It's a little hard for me sometimes. Satan and I met January of 2012 in Indiana at a place called Von Lick Kennels. They're the ones who had the program contract before K2. They were the initials. I met him. I got that dog because when you first get there, they do a little bit of a psychological profile to match you with the right dog. It's a very scientific process. I'm known for being a little off and having a weird sense of humor. I stood up in a room full of men that could have eaten me alive and told them I was the baddest man they've ever met, and they were lucky that I was there. All jokingly, and we thought it was funny, and we all had a good laugh until my buddy says, "Hey, man, they wrote Satan next to your name in there." I was like, okay, well, that's not good. So we go outside in the middle of the Indiana winter, and there's ice on the ground. We, a bunch of Texas and East Coast boys, we all look like a bunch of broken ice skaters trying to walk, you know? Everybody gets their dog, except me. Well, out comes this 100-pound black German Shepherd dragging the professional at Von Lick, who's one of the best trainers in the world, across the parking lot. And they're like, "Hey, big guy, he's yours." Well, I had a torn ACL, and he re-injured it that day because we were trying to jump across a creek, and he's pretty strong, and he flew me across the creek, and I landed on that leg, and that's how we started our relationship. Yeah. We trained together for 60 days stateside before we ever deployed. We trained in Indiana and then in Yuma, Arizona at the Yuma Proving Grounds. 8 hours to 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. The dogs don't ever miss. People ask me, how do you feel comfortable taking a dog into war? How could you do that? And I say, well, do you keep a dog at your house to protect your kids when you're not there? It's the same thing. He took care of my buddies for me. Most of our electronic devices have about an 80 to 85% success ratio. Our dogs at Von Lick were held to a little higher standard than the Lackland dogs. They had a 99.1 success ratio, or they didn't make it into the program. Dogs don't miss. Sometimes the handlers do. That's why we took them. Satan himself was trained on 37 different classes of odors, which turned out to be about 231 different odors he could identify. It's incredible what they can do. After that, we deployed to Afghanistan, did another 30 days there of in-country train-up to learn the explosives and tactics that they were using at the time so that we could be most effective. After that, we pushed out to Ghazni province, Afghanistan, where we found out, as you heard, several military working dogs were killed in action. They let us know then that there was a $25,000 bounty on every dog and every dog handler. That's because we found the IEDs, and that was their number one weapon. Not many times did they want to fight us head on, so we were a big target if they could get it on video, especially killing one of us. Satan was an incredible dog. We had a lot of good times together. A lot of soldiers had a lot of great times with him in addition to the work that he did. We had several charted finds. We spent most of our time subterranean. I specialized in caves. That's where they hid a lot of their caches, were underground. They would literally put Satan and I on a tether, lower us down. We'd come out the other end. So he saved my life more than once down there. So, like I said, those dogs are very effective. They've saved thousands, countless lives of U.S. soldiers, especially when you take into account the second and third order effects of what could happen once an engagement kicks off and other people have to come out there. There's no telling the exponential amount of lives that they saved. On a more personal note with the dogs and soldiers, we used to joke, I mean, what's more American than a soldier and a dog throwing a little bit of apple pie and you're good to go, right? I mean, that's how it goes. You know, we'd be walking around the base and soldiers would just say, hey man, can I touch your dog? I know I can't play with him, but can I pet the dog? It's like, yeah, scratch his chin, he likes it. Just don't get too close to me or you'll find out why they named him that, you know? And I still remember he had this one medic, and I used to laugh with my wife because she was about this big, and she had a squeaky voice. I was like, he thinks it's his squeak toy when he sees her. And I'll never forget, we came back from a really bad mission one day. It had been really rough, and he heard her talking in a shipping container about 100 feet from where I was. He was tuned in on that voice. Takes off, rips his leash out of my hand, and I see him jump in this container, and I hear the giggles in there, and I'm like, oh, well, okay, there you go. I look over there, and they're in there just la, 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 you know, having a great time, and I'm like, that's not what he's here for, you know. But that's just the level of comfort soldiers have around a dog, and then when you see soldiers, before we got there, my unit was in an area that had not been occupied for 3 years. It was a Taliban stronghold, which is why they sent us there. Our guys were getting hit every day. Our worst day, we had 8 IED attacks in one day. And we're sitting at Bagram Air Force Base at this time still playing with these dogs, having to hear about this. We go out there, IED attacks stop within days. 1, because the dogs found them all. 2, because they stop placing them so much because they were losing them. And it's hard for them to get those materials and replace them, especially if they don't do what they're put in to do. There again, that kind of justifies for me why we did what we did. When you really think about it on a very, very basic level, we didn't treat them as property as the military thought, but they were a tool just as us. So a soldier's a tool. That's all he is. Same as those dogs. He did have a rank 1 higher than mine, and that was for judiciary purposes and disciplinary purposes. If you neglected that dog, if you abused that dog, if you struck that dog, you're done. They will throw everything they can at you under Article 15, and you're done. It's basically assaulting of a senior non-commissioned officer that way. And that's good. They deserve that. You know, because we'd go out, and I remember waking up one day, and my buddy Canham had his feet stuck under Satan because it was so cold up there in the mountains, and he forgot his sleeping bag that day. So I wake up, and he's got his feet under Satan, and he's like, glad you got the dog, man. I'm like, I bet you are, you know. But just little things like that. I mean, he was great at his job, but when you think about the other things that those animals bring to the fight, they're invaluable. They really are. As you heard, I was injured. I actually survived 3 blasts and 1 gunshot to the chest. That one hit my plate, so we're all good. I ended up suffering a grand mal seizure and flatlining and had to be medevaced out in end of July, 1st of August, somewhere around, 2012. And since then, until here recently, it was a pretty rough recovery, but I've got it under control and I'm all good. But, you know, it's been a long road, and it's been a long road without him, you know, and it's hard to explain how there was a 6 to 8 month period I stopped looking for him, but it was because I could barely be a husband, father, and contributing adult, much less take on a cause, which is one of the things they hold against me trying to give him back to me. I found him finally after looking for 2 years almost. I was lied to by the Pentagon. I was lied to by private agencies, stonewalled by people trying to keep him away from me. And I was talking to a guy at the gym who, small world, was a TED handler with another unit. And he calls me 2 days later and he's like, dude, I found Satan. I was like, there's no way. He's like, no, I was trolling the internet, man, and talking to some buddies, and they sent me a photo of your dog. So I contacted the family and said, hey, here's who I am, here's what happened. I'd like to, retrieve my dog. With mixed company, and to be polite, I won't tell you the responses I received from them, but they were not nice. I received threats from the government. Any of you have ever worked for or with the government, you know when they tell you it's in your best interest to cease and desist what they're really trying to tell you. I'm not worried. What are they going to do, blow me up again? But that's really, that's how bad it is, because there's so many people at such a high level that were involved in this that they'll do just about anything to try to cover it up. The plus side to that is there are so many people out there in American society who have backed us and come on as advocates to try to help us, and that's how I ended up here speaking to y'all. People that see the wrong that was done in this, see why it should be different, and don't understand how this could possibly happen with the laws that were put in place. I know I'm in a room of people that y'all understand that those laws can be bent and circumvented, and people always find a way to somehow make it happen, and they worry about the consequences later, which is exactly what happened here. They never thought that they were going to face any consequences or retribution to their actions. These dogs sell, as he said at the event at K2, they adopted out a bunch of our dogs to hide the illegal sale or attempted illegal sale of others. We've since found out that all fell through, thank God. But they can fetch anywhere from $80,000 to $100,000 in the open market for one of these dogs fully trained. Yeah, selling them to foreign governments, foreign contract agencies. Yeah, and that's why they did it. There's a lot of money out there. And a lot of the families that were involved in those adoption events that have the dogs, once they found out through all the publication we've done about what happened, a lot of them have returned the dogs to the handlers and said, hey, I had no idea that that was what was going on. I actually feel bad that I had the dog. And like we tell them, it's like a parent who didn't know of a kid or a nephew or niece you didn't know you had, and then you find them and you want to get them back. You're not mad at the foster family. If anything, you owe them more than your own family. So, those that are respectable and honorable people and bringing them back, it's like, yeah, absolutely, you can be a part of the dog's life. We'll do anything we can, and we're friends now for life. I'm indebted to you. Unfortunately, I didn't have one of those families to deal with. Luckily, a lady named Maureen Callahan with the New York Post picked up our story. She was the first one to go out there. She experienced a lot of the same things from the government that I did, and she knew she was going to. But she was brave enough to go out there and put our story out there for us. And within days, it was on Fox News, Happening Now. Of course, they found some guy that had no idea what he was talking about, but had a title and gave him 10 seconds of fame. And it all died back down real quick, which was probably what they were trying to do. That's just my opinion. I don't know how I have to caveat that with this, but yeah, that's my opinion. But after that, a lady in Dallas, Kristen Severance with CBS, contacted me, and she's done several pieces on the story. She went to North Carolina to Congressman Richard Hudson, since that's where the adoptions took place. He and Mac Thornberry from Texas were the main proponents pushing through the defense bill that went through in 2016. There's a lot of people trying to do the right thing, but when you've got so many people going up against those trying to do right, it takes such a long time. And with them doing that now and all the publication, the Inspector General had no choice, but he's had to open an formal investigation into the adoption scandals. So we do possibly have a chance of them being overturned. But without pressure, the government doesn't move fast. They have no reason to do so. None of them are directly affected. And I'm okay with this. I hope I don't offend anybody when I say this, but we're just a bunch of old soldiers. They don't care. Our time's done. They don't need us anymore. So what's their motivation? To make it happen and get them back to us. And the reason I stress that so much is if you truly love animals, especially the way I love Satan, if he's been with somebody for 4 or 5 years, do you think I could, in good conscience, take him back from him? You know how hard that would be to walk away, but that's the thing to do. And it looks like that's what's going to end up happening because the government's going to drag their feet, because it's going to be the easiest thing to do, and there will be no conflict, and then it just dies off. So that's where we are now. Fortunately, we do have some people that are really trying hard to make this right, and that really want to see it, corrected. And we've done some things to where it can't happen again in the future. And I think that's one of the most important parts is to affect change so that this doesn't happen again. Not so much just for the dogs and the handlers, but for society. When you have so much wrong in society, it starts to add up after a while, and it bleeds over into other areas. And something as institutional as the military that is in the public's eye usually held to such a high standard, higher standard than most, they should live to that standard. And so should the U.S. government. I mean, we put them there for a reason, and we trust them to do what they say they would do. And every one of us handlers, I'm not the only one who was injured in combat. There were guys that were hurt a whole lot worse than me. They paid their dues. They did exactly what they said they were going to do. The least the Army could do is do what they were supposed to do in return. Sorry. With that, I want to thank y'all for allowing me to come here. This is not something I normally do, and it's kind of intimidating in a room full of y'all. Hope I didn't say anything that's going to get me sued. But no, on a serious note, I greatly appreciate y'all allowing me to come here and speak to y'all and raise awareness, because y'all are the people that can make that change. I sat through some presentations this morning, and I was glad that I heard them speaking to the law students. I used to speak to the younger soldiers, guys like me in the Army. My time was past. I was the old guy on the way out. Kind of like a pro athlete. 35, you're over the hill. Those of us in the professional world on our way out, there's only so much change that we can institute before we leave. But those coming up, it's not only your opportunity, but it's your responsibility to make changes, to find what you believe in, and to go for it 110%. Whatever wall's there, you can knock it down. Trust me. I've knocked down a few of them. It's just how bad do you want it? How convicted are you? So with that, I greatly appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
I want to thank both of these speakers, and now we're going to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Joyce.
Sarah.
Sarah Amundsen with the Humane Society Legislative Fund. It's the mic, I think. Is that better?
That's what Trump said.
Well, first and foremost, on that note, on this Veterans Day weekend, thank you both so much for your service.
Thank you.
And secondly, I will say, obviously, very compelling stories. We really appreciate you sharing all that you've dealt with and your knowledge base, Mark, no doubt. I think it's very interesting that Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, who was so critical in the early stage of these developments with these military dogs, was also critical to the early developments of the retirement of chimpanzees used by the Air Force. And frankly, in making that connection, the question that arose to me is, while dogs in the military are classified as property, they clearly were treated far differently than chimpanzees utilized by the Air Force, now with the ongoing retirement program. And Joyce, this may be a question for you and Mark as the attorneys. What would happen if animals used by the military were no longer classified as property, and how would that change situations like what we're seeing with the retirement and reunification of the dogs, and also the ongoing difficulties we're having in permanently retiring those chimpanzees?
Well, I think that positive developments would flow from the animals not being classified as property, just as the same would hold true in the civilian world. In the case of the military working dogs, as I mentioned, that they were considered property is what led to them be left behind overseas, because when that tank is no longer serviceable, it stays there. It doesn't get put on a ship and brought back to the U.S. There's no reason to do that. And so kind of an institutional mindset, that dog's got a national stock number, it's a piece of equipment, it stays there also. So if that is removed and they're not considered equipment, they're considered canine members of the military, then I think that obviously just perceptionally treatment changes. And I think the same would hold true for the chimpanzees.
But it is clearly a positive sign, subtle perhaps, that we stopped classifying these dogs as equipment, as it is a positive sign, very positive sign, that I didn't think I'd live to see that when the NIH declared that chimpanzees would no longer be used in research and would be retired. Step by step.
From a more simple viewpoint, unfortunately, as much as it shouldn't, we all know a name or moniker can sometimes determine an entire attitude towards something. So I fully believe that the change could be change the situation completely.
If I could say one more thing, I don't know this for a fact, but my own personal thought is that the 2012 bill, the Canine Members of the Military Act, that did not get enacted, I think that didn't get enacted because of that one provision. Because the other provisions in there were all very, I don't see how anybody would be upset. And one thing to note, that none of those provisions cost the government $1. It was to donate to frequent flyer miles. It was a nonprofit that was going to take care of the animals. That wasn't going to be funded. It was going to be a nonprofit that was supposed to step up, contribute their money, fundraise to have a pool of money to take care of retired military working dogs. So the government wasn't going to cost the government a dime, but the one thing in there was, we're not going to consider these animals pieces of equipment anymore. They're going to have a special status, and I think that probably scared people off, because what are the after effects out in the rest of our society?
Nora.
I want to thank you both for your service as well. I did 2 years in the reserves as a JAG officer, so I have my ex did 2 tours in Iraq, so I have a very special place in my heart for the military, and I'm very grateful to guys especially the guys that deploy. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Your story about Satan was heartbreaking. I mean, I'm sure I could speak for everyone in here. I think there were a lot of tears even held back, and I was wondering if, besides trying these venues of going to the government and trying to, or even the press, have you thought of litigating, or have you tried litigating and asked the judiciary to step in with perhaps a petition to compel return of your dog?
I have. I think that's one area that I probably could step up my game a little bit. I had some lawyers contact me and tell me that, hey, I've got to do a certain amount of pro bono work every year. He was a former JAG attorney and was going to take on my case, and everything was rocking and rolling for a little bit, and then it just died down, and now he doesn't even return my calls.
Well, I'm happy to talk. I'm a litigator. I'm not admitted in Texas, but I'd be happy
Well,
to
Joyce
talk
told me this might happen.
I'll give you my card. But no
honestly,
charge. But
honestly, anything I told Joyce, I said, I'm a pretty passionate person, and I get pretty intense a lot of the times, but anything within the limits of the law, I'll do whatever.
I
can.
think you, I mean, why not? It's a
Okay.
petition to the court. Then you get a whole different element introduced into this situation. You have the judiciary now, and it's a separate branch of government. I mean, I don't know. I want to see you get Satan back.
Okay. You two will meet after this
Yeah.
panel. I can see this happening. Thank you.
Hi, Nicholas Hudson. One of the things that I noticed from both of your speeches is there seems to be a pretty substantial disconnect between how the dogs are classified, at the legal level, the higher level, the duty level, and how they're actually treated, by the boots on the ground. It strikes me as though perhaps a major problem then is that the people who work most with these dogs probably have the least ability to engage in a lot of public advocacy. I'm imagining active duty service members don't have much in the way that they can do for, say, protesting or what have you. What sort of formal or informal things can the actual service members who work with the dogs do to bring more attention to the civilian oversight to perhaps change some of these policies that are, hurting the animals?
Well, those still in can do nothing. They've all been silenced by their command, threatened under different UCMJ actions if they speak out, if they try to say anything or do anything. That's one of the reasons that I've been so hardcore going forward and been such a face for it with so many different entities, because they can't do anything to me. And from the government side, if they want to try, go ahead. I've been hurt before, it's fine. They can't intimidate some of us like they can those soldiers in, so there's nothing they can do. And that's why we have so few voices, because a lot of the guys, even if they're not handlers now, they're still active duty military. So it looks like there's only a few of us affected. And unfortunately, that's just the nature of the game when you're in the Army. You do exactly what your command says. Instead of the command stepping up like they should and say, hey, I've got these soldiers who've been wrong like this, there again, it's just easier to say, hey, you guys be quiet, forget that it happened, and go train.
I would say that the military is a very chain of command driven organization. It lives and dies by the chain of command. So if for those who feel that there's something wrong or have been wronged, then the proper procedure is to elevate it up the chain of command. Now what they do with it, you have no control over that. There always is a recourse. I've certainly seen soldiers who file congressionals, so they go to their congressmen or senators, and the senators look into it, which I think has happened in this case too. But I don't think we have a resolution on what the congressmen or senators have found thus far.
Right.
But you're correct. I mean, you, as members of the military, we're precluded from lobbying or getting involved, to that extent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joyce, what a great panel. Thank you all, both for your service and to your service for Toby and for Satan. We actually have a golden retriever named Ranger in honor of what you guys do. So since the litigation question was asked, I think maybe really what we could do is look for some co-counsel for you. But I have two questions. Where would we look to keep updated on this situation with Satan? And then my second question, I'm Marilyn Forbes, I teach animal law at Duke, is I've been aware of frustration with returning vets getting therapy dogs, and that there's sort of great tension with the VA about the value of therapy dogs and whether it's been scientifically proven. And I'm just curious if you have a minute on that. I'd love to hear about it.
I actually do. That's new to me, and I'm actually going to look into that because I cause a lot of trouble down at the VA for the right reasons. Like I said, I appreciate a good fight as much as anybody. But I was authorized for a service dog, and all I did was ask my doctor. I think a lot of it has to do with your disability rating and the nature of your disability rating. Most of mine is due to TBI-related issues, and I'm 100% disabled due to combat injuries. So there again, I may not face some of the challenges some of the other soldiers had, but I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't know that, because it was so easy for me. I mean, he wrote the letter in the same appointment I asked for it and gave it to me. I have it trying so that I can use that as more ammo to try to get Satan back, saying, hey, not only am I a dog handler, but I'm eligible for a service dog. What more perfect fit would be than my dog getting him back?
All right, great. So there's some more justice to be had.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you both for your service and for speaking here today. I actually have two questions. The first is, and I'm speaking as a civilian, so maybe I'm wrong, but I know of no other military property that receives a rank. And so I'm just wondering how the military sort of justifies treating them as property while they're given ranks similar to human soldiers, and if that's sort of an issue that anybody's kind of thought about, and the fact that they really are treated and also given a rank, and I don't know of any other equipment that is. And then, I'll let you answer that one first.
Well, the rank that they're given is unofficial. It's not,
Okay.
they are not officially Sergeant Rex. That's an unofficial measure that's taken. So that answers that aspect of things.
Okay.
That's
and
more
then-
of an internal cultural thing,
Yeah.
just,
Okay.
yeah.
And then my other question is about contract working dogs. I know obviously there's been a lot of efforts with military working dogs, but I read even just this past summer that there was a contract that was terminated, and then a bunch of dogs overseas that were contract
You speaking
working
of
dogs-
Eastern
oh, sorry,
Canines?
that were contract working dogs ended up being killed. And I'm just wondering if there's any efforts when you look at some of this legislation to include provisions for the return of contract dogs or any sort of care for them.
There actually is. To answer your other question, where to keep up with everything going on, if you get on Facebook, there's a page called Justice for TED Handlers. They're a huge advocacy group that have done a lot for us. Or you can go, if you want to follow Satan's story, Bring Satan Home Tango 383 on Facebook is where you can find that. And through that, the contract working dogs, there's Mission Canine Rescue that does a lot with CWDs because nobody pays attention to them. You're speaking of the Eastern Canine deaths from this summer, correct? Yeah. Eastern Canine Securities Company, we've done a lot with that since then. We've actually gotten a lot of those dogs back to the States. Louisa Kastner has brought a lot of those back with Mission Canine Rescue. And she's trying to do a lot to get those. It's hard for the government to be able to have as much say in that because it's a private entity company versus the military, but we're on it. Trust me, yeah, we're on it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Inman. I'm a 2L with Oklahoma City University School of Law. And I'm going to broaden this conversation a little bit because I'm going to broaden this to animals that the government uses, and so that would include horses. And it's interesting that we're having all this discussion about dogs, but yet I haven't heard any of this kind of discussion going on with horses that have served in the military. And I'm not sure if horses are still used in
They
the
are.
military. I think they are, yeah. But they're just as, I don't want to say just as, but they do service their trainer. They develop bonds with each other. There's similar situations going on with the horse and the trainer relationship there, but I'm not exactly sure what kinds of things they do in terms of retiring the horses or where the horses go or that kind of thing. But I do know that horses were used a lot in wars, and that even today, like you said, they're still used in the military, and they're still used quite a lot in local precincts on the police force and things like that. So I'm a little bit discouraged that we have these kinds of conversations and this kind of enthusiasm and excitement going on around dogs, but yet I haven't heard anything about horses or any other kind of animals that the government has used in the past. So I'm not sure if I'm looking for any kind of answer from you, but is there any kind of discussion, or do you know of anything that goes on with, is there any statutes on the books about horses being used and how they are being retired and what their lives are like afterwards, or, you know, anything like that?
Well,
So.
I worked with dogs. That's all I know.
Yeah, I figured that.
That's all I know.
Yeah.
I know we had pack horses that helped move some of the equipment because the choppers couldn't go up above a certain elevation, and we operated at such a high level. But other than that,
Were those pack horses shipped, or were they domesticated in the country that you were in? Do you know?
I'd be lying if I answered that question.
As far as I know, the only horses that the Army still has are ceremonial. So there's not many. There's a few, like the 1st Cavalry Division has a little ceremonial unit of horses that they bring out for parades. There's the horses that are at the National Cemetery that they use for the military funerals. I'm pretty sure that any horses that we would be using in country, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, were not Army horses. They were ones that were acquired on site to help move supplies.
Probably.
So I can't speak to like the retirement issue with the horses, but I think the reason that there's more of a focus on the dogs is the volume. There's so many, we're talking thousands of dogs. I think we if we had 100 horses, I'd be, in the Army, I'd be surprised.
In the entire Army, you think there's only 100 horses?
Well, we don't
We
use horses
use
like we used to use
trucks now.
horses.
Okay, thank you.
So with that, we want to thank both of these speakers